Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. Welcome to the channel. If this is the first time you've seen this channel, I'm going to do a video which is a link to the Booktube at War event. So I'm putting this video out now, and I reread this book deliberately now because of this event. So I'm actually involved in the Historathon for this year, and I was planning on reading this later on in the year because it would link to the time zones that we created in the Historathon. So big shout out to Vin from Revenant Reads for the Historathon event that I'm co-hosting, and I was going to talk about it then, but I'm going to talk about it now because I think it's a really nice way to give a nod to the Booktube at War event. So I know Michael K. Vaughan created it out of a suggestion from someone who comments on this video. So it wasn't from a booktuber. The initial idea came from a commentator, which I think is fantastic. So he brought in a few other people to do it. So I know Steve Donohue's involved, and Booktime with Elvis, Mark from Booktime with Elvis, and Ollie from Criminolly, Sean the Book Maniac's doing it, the Book Knitter, I think that's her name, she's doing it. There's a bunch of people doing it. I think possibly Greg from another bit of our reads as well. But it's a really good event. It's a great idea to focus on war, different types of war. But I wanted to talk about this book because it's such an important book, and I thought it'd be nice to make a nod to the event with it. And you may know, if you've seen my videos before, that I'm a history graduate. So I have studied this event quite a lot, in both in my A-level and in my degree, and I feel like this take on this particular thing is very special. It's very personalised, very nuanced. It's very important. So what I'm talking about is Art Spiegelman's absolutely seminal piece of work, graphic novel called Mouse. Mouse is Art Spiegelman's father's story. So he's telling his father's story as a survivor of Auschwitz. So this is definitely about the Jewish story of the Second World War, the build-up in the 30s to what happened to the Jewish population in Europe, and about the concentration camps eventually in Auschwitz in particular. But also there's a really good sense of the after effects of it as well, which I think is really important. It's one of the best aspects of the book. So just to start off with, this came out in, well, this is actually called The Complete Mouse because it's got two parts to it. So the first part came out in 1986, and then the second part came in 1992, and then this particular version was 2003. But it was combined as a collection before that. But 1986 and 1992 were when these two parts came out. And graphic novels in the mid-80s, it was kind of the start of a more mature, serious look at comics, and the term graphic novel was relatively new at the time. So Mouse was a really big part of looking at the comic form in a more serious and mature way, and telling really important stories, and not in this sense, although you could argue maybe, but certainly it was a time of allegorical comics and much more realistic messages being put, and political comics being put out. And obviously this is a historical document. It's in many ways you could sort of describe it as a primary source, because it's the story of the author's father. So you've got a very personal account based on interviews that Art Spiegelman had done, that sort of builds up to him wanting to do the book. So he's there's several interviews that he does in the 70s that result in him wanting to create this book. So yeah, in the 80s it did have quite an impact anyway, and I think it's done a very significant job, had significant impact on the comic form and graphic novels in general. but it's also a really important history book. So I know this has been used for teaching school kids about World War II, and I think that's a really good application for it. I think it's definitely something that could happen. And I think why it's so good is sometimes when you read a non-fiction history textbook about the build-up to the war in the 30s and how across Europe the Nazis managed to solidify and consolidate their power and start ghettoizing the Jews, so that by the time you get sort of up to like once you get the war started and you get what they called the final solution happening and the concentration camps, you've got, if you have this put across in a textbook, then it can be a little bit impersonal, and I think the power of this is how it's been recounted through the Art's parents and through his father's voice, all wrapped up in a very real and well characterized depiction of Art Spiegelman's relationship with his father. So it's not a perfect relationship, and it's that I think that part of it's really interesting. And I know in an interview that I saw a little while ago, Art Spiegelman said that sometimes people assume that you're going to be tread on eggshells and make sure that a Holocaust survivor has the perfect life afterwards. But as a kid, you want certain things from your parents. If you don't get them, then you have these, moments of tension and these arguments and that kind of thing. And his relationship with his father wasn't perfect, and that's depicted in the book. And I think that's a really good element of it. That's not necessarily part of telling the story of what happened in the 40s and the 30s and 40s, but it is actually quite significant because a lot of it comes from the after effects of being a Holocaust survivor and how he carries it with him all his life, and actually therefore how Art Spiegelman ends up dealing with it as well. So it's like it carries on, it doesn't just end with him surviving the nightmare that he has to go through. It's also the after effects and what he's like as a parent, and how Art has to kind of live with that as well. So I think that's a really interesting part of it. But clearly, all of that doesn't matter unless you've got this very vivid, sometimes visceral, deeply upsetting depiction of what happened to the Jews. The Jews were basically dehumanized, and they are literally dehumanized in this graphic novel as the mice are the Jews, and the Germans are depicted as cats. There's other animals as well. So the non-Jewish Polish, because Art Spiegelman's family were Polish Jews, but the non-Jewish Polish were pigs, and the French were also different animals as well. They were frogs, and they're very humanoid animals. You can see that it's basically their heads that are the animals. They are very anthropomorphized. So that's true. But I think it distances the reader from the horrors of what you're reading quite well, but it's also quite stark in places, and the nightmare of what happened is on the page, and some of the panels in the graphic novel are very hard to read. Some of it's very, very, very strong, and quite rightly so. So I do think that this is a wholly successful graphic novel because of the message, the delivery, with the way that it's framed around Art's father telling him the story, the sort of allegorical nature of having these animals being the characters in the book works really well. The fact that it doesn't just suddenly jump in with Auschwitz, and you've got the slow build-up of what happened to the Jewish Poles in the 30s is really important, because one of the sort of nuanced, interesting things, but absolutely crucial things about what happened to Germany in the 30s and 40s is how slow the build-up was. It happened over years, and the Polish Jews were just in disbelief about, well, what's happening? Is this really happening? Is this? I've heard stories of people disappearing. Are they disappearing? I've heard of these gas chambers. Is that a thing? Why are they getting put on these trains? And there was all these questions about rumors they were hearing, and the fact that this was a slow build. Exactly the same way as the Germans were also. It kind of crept up on them. And it's a really interesting way of looking at it, because without that context, it seems such a surreal thing to have happened, and it obviously is a surreal thing to have happened. It's to dehumanize an entire ethnic group is literally insane, but quite hard to imagine, quite hard to empathize with. But to not feel like that, but see it around you, that disbelief and that kind of like, is that really happening? Does that seem strange? Is that what I'm hearing? Is all the way through this. And I think that's a really important part of the historical context of what happened. So, yeah, I think this is a really good way of telling the story. It is a vital part of our history. It is a story that needs to be told. It's funny though, because sometimes you think, this is probably the most repeated story in our schools, in history, and all that kind of thing. But you still get people that are trying to argue that it didn't happen. So this makes this book so important. And this book has been banned in some places. The excuse for it being banned is like really silly. So they'll say it's being banned for nudity and that kind of thing. And ultimately, this story has to be told. It's a very successful and powerful way of telling the story. And if you haven't read it, I couldn't recommend it enough. Art Spiegelman's Mouse, A Survivor Story. Thanks a lot for watching.